The bus hissed to a stop at the corner of Jefferson Avenue and Elmwood Street, its doors groaning as they swung open. A tired stream of passengers shuffled aboard, their faces etched with the quiet exhaustion of a long day. Among them was an elderly black man, moving with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had long learned the art of patience. His frame was thin but not frail, and his eyes held the weight of years lived fully and painfully. A sturdy wooden cane rested in his hand, the varnish smooth from years of gripping. In his other hand he carried a small brown paper bag, its contents barely rustling as he made his way toward the back of the bus. The man lowered himself into a seat by the window with a quiet grace that didn't demand attention, but somehow commanded it. The evening light spilled through the glass, casting a soft glow on his weathered face. Deep lines carved into his skin hinted at stories untold, struggles endured, lessons learned. His gaze drifted toward the world outside, watching the blur of passing buildings and fading sunlight. His posture was composed, his expression calm, but there was a quiet strength beneath the stillness, the kind that comes from surviving things others can't even imagine. The usual noise of the bus surrounded him, the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional chime of a phone. Yet amidst it all, the old man seemed untouched, a steady presence in a space that pulsed with restless energy. A young child sitting across the aisle glanced curiously at him before offering a shy smile. The man's lips curved into a faint but genuine response, his eyes softening with warmth. But not everyone saw the quiet dignity he carried. Not everyone understood the depth of experience behind those steady eyes. And soon enough, that lack of understanding would lead to something unforgettable. As the bus slowed for the next stop, a shift in the air signaled that the peace was about to break. The doors opened with a sharp metallic creak, and a group of teenagers bounded up the steps, their laughter loud and sharp against the quiet hum of the bus. The old man's eyes remained fixed on the window, his hand resting on the cane. He did not yet know that the next few minutes would force the bus and everyone on it to confront something far greater than a moment of teenage mischief.
The bus screeched to a halt at the next stop, the sudden jolt making a few passengers glance up from their phones. The doors creaked open, and the quiet rhythm of the ride was shattered as a group of teenagers boarded, their voices loud and sharp against the subdued atmosphere. 4 of them, 3 boys and a girl, swaggered down the aisle with the careless energy of youth. Backpacks slung over one shoulder, sneakers scuffing the floor, they laughed in that exaggerated way that demanded attention. They weren't just talking, they were performing. The tallest of the group, a boy with a baseball cap turned backward, led the charge. His grin was wide and confident, his eyes scanning the passengers like a predator looking for prey. He nudged his friend, a boy with a buzz cut, and pointed toward the back of the bus. "Yo, check him out," he said, his voice low but loud enough to carry through the bus. The others followed his gaze to the elderly man seated by the window, his cane resting against his knee. The girl smirked. "Looks like someone missed the retirement home," she said, her tone syrupy with mock sweetness. The buzzcut boy snorted, and the others laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that made the air feel heavier. The elderly man's gaze remained fixed on the window, his face impassive, but his grip on the cane tightened slightly. The boy in the cap leaned toward the elderly man, his smile widening. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" His sneaker tapped lightly against the cane. The others edged closer, their laughter growing louder as they fed off each other's energy. A woman sitting near the front shifted her purse closer to her chest. A man in a suit adjusted his tie, keeping his eyes down. No one said a word. No one moved. Another boy, shorter than the others with a hoodie pulled over his head, chimed in. "That cane for walking or holding you up?" he snickered, his eyes bright with amusement. The laughter swelled again, but the elderly man remained still. His gaze didn't shift from the window, his posture steady despite the taunts. His silence seemed to irritate them more. "You think he's got money on him?" the buzzcut boy said, his voice rising. He reached toward the paper bag resting on the man's lap. "What's in the bag, Grandpa? Cat food?" The boy in the cap leaned in even closer, his sneaker now pressing lightly against the cane. His eyes narrowed. "Come on, old man," he sneered. "Say something." A few passengers stole nervous glances toward the back of the bus, their discomfort palpable. But no one spoke. No one intervened. The bus rumbled over a pothole, jostling the passengers, but the old man's posture remained unchanged. His calm, steady presence was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy surrounding him. For a brief moment, the boy in the cap hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the man's face. There was no fear there, no anger, just a quiet stillness that somehow felt more unsettling than any confrontation. But the hesitation passed quickly. The boy's smirk returned. "Come on, Grandpa. What's the matter?" Too tired to keep up, the bus rolled forward, the sound of its engine mixing with the teenagers' packed laughter. Yet beneath the noise, a tension lingered heavy, unspoken. The elderly man's grip on his cane tightened just slightly, his eyes still fixed on the world beyond the window. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Something deeper was stirring beneath the surface. Something the teenagers were too young and too arrogant to understand. The boy in the cap's sneaker tapped against the elderly man's cane again, harder this time. The sound of rubber against wood cut through the low hum of the bus engine. The man's knuckles tightened slightly on the handle of the cane, but his face remained calm. His eyes, still fixed on the window, reflected the fading light outside. The quiet dignity in his expression seemed to hang in the air, stretching the silence between them until it was taut enough to snap. "What's the matter, old man?" The boy in the cap pressed, his tone edged with impatience. He leaned in closer, his breath almost brushing the man's ear. "Too scared to say something?" The elderly man's gaze didn't shift. His shoulders relaxed despite the proximity of the teenager. The bus jolted over a crack in the road, and the boy stumbled slightly, grabbing the nearest handrail to steady himself. His friends laughed, their voices sharp and biting, but the old man's stillness seemed to unsettle them more than any reaction would have. The boy in the hoodie stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe he doesn't speak English," he joked, prompting another round of laughter. A woman sitting 2 rows ahead stiffened, her hand gripping the strap of her purse. A man in a business suit glanced toward the back of the bus, then quickly looked away. No one spoke up. No one moved. The tension in the air was palpable. A fragile line stretched too thin. The boy in the cap leaned down, his face now inches from the elderly man's ear. His eyes gleamed with the shallow thrill of dominance. "Come on, Grandpa," he whispered. "Say something." And then, slowly, the old man's hand lifted from the cane and settled calmly on his lap. His fingers were long and weathered, veins prominent beneath dark skin. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting the boy's eyes for the first time. There was no anger there, no fear, just a calm steadiness that made the boy's smile falter. "Do you boys always find fun in bothering strangers?" the elderly man asked, his voice low but clear. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the length of the bus like a ripple on still water. The teenagers exchanged quick glances, momentarily thrown off balance. The boy in the hoodie scoffed, trying to regain control. "What's it to you?" he shot back, his smirk thin and brittle. The old man's gaze didn't waver. "Because I've met young men like you before," he said, his tone measured, steady. "Different time, different place. They didn't laugh as much when they found out what real fear feels like." The air grew heavier, the space between them shrinking into something dangerous. The boy in the cap's smile slipped further. His eyes darkened. "Oh yeah?" he said, his voice sharper now. "And what would you know about fear?" The old man's eyes sharpened. For the first time, a quiet intensity flickered beneath the calm. "I was 19, he said, his voice steady but weighted with something deeper. "Vietnam." The word landed like a stone in water, sending invisible ripples through the bus. Even the chatter of the other passengers dimmed. The boy in the hoodie's smirk vanished. The girl's gaze dropped to the floor. The buzzcut boy shifted awkwardly, his hands finding the strap of his backpack. "When I was your age," the old man continued, his voice soft but razor-sharp, "I carried something much heavier than a cane. I carried a rifle through jungles half a world away. I carried the weight of knowing that the person walking beside me might not live to see the next sunrise. And when I came home," his hand tightened around the cane, "I carried the memories of those who didn't." The boy in the cap swallowed hard, his bravado flickering under the weight of the words. The old man's eyes remained on his, steady and unyielding. "You think strength is about pushing someone down?" the man said, his voice quiet but cutting. "Strength is knowing when to stand tall and when to sit quietly." The boy in the hoodie shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted toward his friends, but none of them were laughing anymore. The old man's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The boy in the cap straightened, his smile gone. He forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "We were just messing around," he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier. The old man's gaze softened just slightly. "Messing around can get you into trouble," he said quietly. "Sometimes trouble you can't get out of." A sharp hush settled over the bus. The old man's grip on his cane relaxed, his gaze drifting once more toward the window. The boy in the cap hesitated for a moment longer before stepping back, his eyes clouded with something that looked dangerously close to shame. The bus rolled forward, the sound of the engine steady beneath the lingering silence. The old man's face remained calm, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching the reflection of the boy's face in the window. For the first time that evening, the teenager's eyes dropped. And for the first time, he was at a loss for words. The bus swayed as it rolled through another intersection, the engine's low hum filling the heavy silence. The boy in the cap stood frozen, his smirk gone, his eyes locked with the old man's. The quiet weight of the man's words still lingered in the stale air, pressing down on everyone aboard. The other teenagers shifted uneasily, the tension now palpable. The elderly man's gaze remained steady, his hand resting lightly on the cane as if it were more of an anchor than a crutch. The boy in the hoodie spoke first, his tone hollow. "Vietnam, huh?" He forced a small laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So what? That's ancient history." The old man's gaze sharpened. Slowly, he straightened his back, his posture gaining a quiet authority that made him seem larger than he was. "Ancient history," he repeated, his voice calm but cutting. "Let me tell you about that history." Like he inhaled slowly, the breath steady. "I was 19, he said, "barely older than you. I carried an M16 through the jungles of Quang Tri. The air was thick with heat and the sound of insects. And death. It was always there. Sometimes we smelled it before we saw it. Sometimes it came with a single step, a tripwire hidden beneath a patch of leaves." The teenagers were silent now, their eyes fixed on the old man. Even the other passengers leaned in slightly, drawn into the gravity of his words. His voice remained steady, unembellished, but every syllable carried the weight of truth. "I remember the first time I saw a man die," the old man continued. "He was my friend. We grew up 2 streets apart, played football together, and then one day we were pinned down in a clearing. He was shot through the chest, and I couldn't reach him." His hand tightened around the cane, his knuckles whitening. "He called for his mother before he died. That sound, it never leaves you." The bus hit a bump, rattling the windows, but the old man's voice didn't waver. "I carried men on my back while bullets shredded the trees above me. I watched boys who hadn't even started shaving die with their hands gripping their helmets. And when I came home..." His gaze darkened. "We were called monsters. We were spit on. We weren't given parades, we were given silence." The boy in the cap swallowed hard, his hands slipping into his jacket pockets. The hoodie-wearing boy glanced at his friend, his expression uneasy. The girl's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her earlier smirk replaced by a hard line. The old man's voice softened, but it remained sharp. "You think strength is in tearing someone down? You think you're proving something by mocking a stranger?" He shook his head slowly. "Strength is standing tall when the world gives you nothing to stand on. Strength is carrying the weight of ghosts and still waking up the next day." For the first time, the boy in the cap's eyes dropped. His foot edged away from the cane. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. The old man watched him for a moment longer, then sighed quietly. His hand relaxed on the cane. "You don't know what fear is," he said. "But maybe one day you will." The bus slowed as it approached another stop. The old man's gaze drifted toward the window, his reflection faint against the city lights beyond the glass. Behind him, the teenagers stood in awkward silence, the bravado that had fueled them now hollow and empty. The boy in the hoodie rubbed the back of his neck. The buzz-cut boy stared at the floor. The girl tucked her hair behind her ear, avoiding eye contact. The doors opened with a mechanical hiss. The old man's reflection lingered on the glass for a moment longer before he turned back toward the teenagers. His eyes met the boy in the caps. "Strength isn't loud," he said quietly. "It's knowing when to be still." The boy in the cap swallowed hard. The old man's gaze softened slightly, but his expression remained calm. The bus rolled forward, but the quiet that settled over the passengers was deeper than before. A shift had occurred, something unspoken, but undeniable. The bus rolled forward, the steady hum of the engine filling the silence that had settled like a heavy fog. The teenagers stood motionless, their earlier bravado now replaced by an uncertain stillness. The boy in the cap's hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. The boy in the hoodie leaned against the handrail, his eyes darting nervously between his friends and the elderly man. The weight of the old man's words lingered in the stale bus air, pressing down on them in a way they weren't prepared to handle. The old man's gaze drifted toward the window. The reflection of his calm, steady eyes mirrored faintly in the glass. He had returned to stillness, his hand resting lightly on his cane, but the quiet authority he had commanded in those last few moments still vibrated through the air. He didn't need to say anything else. The damage had been done. Not to him, but to the fragile egos of the teenagers who had thought they held control. The boy in the hoodie broke the silence first. He rubbed the back of his neck, his mouth twisting as though he wanted to speak but couldn't quite find the right words. His eyes flicked toward the boy in the cap, searching for some kind of cue or guidance, but the cap-wearing boy didn't meet his gaze. His head was lowered, his jaw tight. "Man, we didn't mean anything by it," the hoodie-wearing boy mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's gaze didn't shift. He remained composed, his expression calm but thoughtful. The silence stretched painfully between them. The boy in the cap's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. His fingers curled around the edges of his jacket pockets as though searching for something to anchor him. "We were just messing around," the boy in the cap said, but there was no conviction behind the words. His voice was thin, brittle. He stole a glance at the old man's reflection in the window, but the calm steadiness in those eyes made him drop his gaze again. The girl, who had been standing behind them with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her earlier smirk had faded completely. Her mouth opened as though to say something, but she hesitated. Finally, she sighed quietly. "We didn't mean to disrespect you," she said, her voice soft but clear. The old man finally turned his head toward them. His gaze was steady, not unkind but piercing. "Disrespect isn't just in the words," he said. "It's in how you carry yourself." The buzz-cut boy, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, cleared his throat. His face was flushed, and he avoided looking at anyone directly. "We're sorry," he said quietly. The sincerity in his voice was obvious. He rubbed the back of his neck and shuffled his feet. "We didn't know." His voice trailed off. The old man's eyes softened, just slightly. "No, you didn't," he said. "But now you do." The bus hit a bump in the road, making the handrails rattle. The teenagers all shifted in place, their movements suddenly smaller, more restrained. They were no longer performing, no longer seeking attention. The boy in the hoodie ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "Guess we kinda messed up, huh?" The old man's mouth curved into the slightest hint of a smile. "Most people do at some point," he said. "The real test is how you carry yourself afterward." The boy in the cap lifted his head slowly. His eyes met the old man's for the first time since the conversation began. The arrogance had drained from his expression, leaving behind something quieter, something uncertain. He nodded once, barely perceptible. "Yeah," he said. "I guess so." The bus slowed for the next stop. A few passengers shifted in their seats, casting curious glances toward the back of the bus. The tension that had once saturated the air had lifted, replaced by a quiet understanding. The boy in the hoodie glanced toward the door, then back at the old man. Take care, man," he said awkwardly. The old man nodded once. "You too?" The teenagers started toward the door. The boy in the cap lingered for a moment longer, his eyes flicking toward the old man one last time. "Thanks," he muttered. "For what?" the old man asked, his expression calm. The boy shrugged. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think I will." The doors hissed open. The teenagers stepped off the bus, their earlier laughter and swagger now replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. The boy in the cap glanced toward his friends as they walked down the sidewalk, but his eyes drifted back toward the bus as it pulled away from the curb. The old man watched them through the window, his expression calm. His gaze returned to the street as the city lights blurred past the glass. His hand settled on his cane, his posture relaxed. The bus rumbled forward, carrying its passengers toward their separate destinations. But for those 4 teenagers, the real journey, the one toward understanding and respect, was only beginning. The bus hummed steadily as it pulled away from the curb. Through the window, the teenagers could be seen walking down the sidewalk, their heads lowered, their movements quieter. The boy in the cap lingered for a moment, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, before glancing back toward the bus one last time. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A lesson learned, one that would follow him long after the bus had disappeared from view. Inside the bus, the old man remained seated, his gaze drifting toward the window. The reflection of city lights flickered across the glass, blending with the soft contours of his weathered face. His hand rested calmly on his cane, his grip relaxed now. He had faced storms before, storms far greater than the one that had just passed. And yet, there was something in the quiet shift of the bus's atmosphere that made this moment feel different. A woman seated near the front turned toward him. Her eyes were soft, her expression one of quiet admiration. "Thank you," she said simply. The old man's eyes lifted to meet hers, his gaze steady. He gave a small nod, nothing more. A young woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," she said, her voice tentative but sincere. "He never talked about it, but I think he carried the same weight you're talking about." The old man's gaze softened. "Most of us did," he said quietly, "and some of us still do." There was a pause, not uncomfortable but reflective. The other passengers seemed more aware now, more present. Some sat in silence, their gazes drifting toward the floor. Others stole quiet glances toward the old man, as if seeing him differently now. Not just as an elderly passenger with a cane, but as someone who had weathered storms most of them would never know. As the bus approached the next stop, the old man shifted in his seat, his gaze returning to the window. The boy in the hoodie's last words echoed faintly in his mind. "We didn't know." No, they hadn't known. But now they did. And maybe, just maybe, they would carry that lesson with them. The bus slowed. The old man rose from his seat, his cane steadying his frame as he made his way toward the door. A few passengers moved aside instinctively, giving him space. He paused at the steps, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the bus one last time. "Be kind to each other," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You never know the battle someone's fighting." And then he stepped off the bus, the doors closing behind him with a soft hiss. The passengers remained quiet for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Slowly, the bus rolled forward, fading into the blur of city lights. If this story resonates with you, comment 1 below. If you think there's room for improvement, comment 2. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and we'll see you soon with another unforgettable tale.